I'm going to be taking you guys through what I am doing for my low back injury. Reason being, I injured my low back yesterday in a way that I've never experienced before, and I'm feeling things that I've never experienced before. And in a way, it's really good for me because it allows me to relate to the people that I work with and my clients that have, said, like, here's what I'm experiencing, here's what I'm feeling, and I've never felt those things in my own body until yesterday. So it's easier to relate to these things now, and I can kind of explore and play around with things myself, which is great. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this class. I figured rather than just doing all of this behind the scenes, I'd throw a camera up and film it for you guys so that you guys can give it a watch. If you ever want to try it and follow along, you can try it and follow along. It might give you some ideas of things that you can play around with and assess and move, and just some things that you can use or some tools you can add for your toolbox in case you ever find yourself in this position where you injured your low back. But I must preface this by saying this is not medical advice. Just because I'm doing these things does not mean I'm telling you that you should do it, because your back injury might be different than my back injury, and it's likely the case. But now I'm going to start with a little bit of exploration for my back. So I'm going to take you guys through some lumbar cars. But again, the goal is not to look like me or just follow along with exactly what I'm doing. I'm just going to be talking you guys through what I'm doing with my low back as we do this, what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling, what I'm doing about what I'm seeing and what I'm feeling. So I'm going to come up into all fours. I'm not going to be going through a full segmental cat-cow, meaning I'm not really going to be doing my upper back. I'm just going to be doing my lower back because that's the part that, again, I injured. My upper back has been feeling pretty unfazed by all of this. And so I'm just going to start with a little bit of a segmental cat-cow, which I must say for my low back, so just trying to segmentally go into flexion and then segmentally go into extension. Normally, I can do this pretty well. Today and yesterday was even worse, not so well. It is not moving so well today. I have a harder time feeling each individual vertebrae. Instead, it feels like 2 vertebrae in my low back as compared to the 6 that I have. And for most people, that's 5. And so it's a totally different experience today than it was before. And that doesn't mean that I've lost all my progress by any means necessary, and nor do I ever want you to feel that way. If you ever find yourself in this position where it's like, hey, I got really good at this, and then you have an injury or a setback, and suddenly it feels like you're back at like step 1. You're not back at step 1, but it might feel that way, but you'll just have to remind yourself that this is not a reflection of your progress that you made. It's just a reflection of this singular point in time, and it's temporary, and it's going to get better, right? So try to stay positive. So when I go segmentally, which, like I said, isn't really segmentally because I'm moving like a brick today, into flexion, I feel a little bit of like, I'm hesitant to even call it discomfort. Yesterday, this would have been painful. Today, it just feels really tight along my left side as I come up into flexion. And when I make my way down into extension, which, like I said, is just way more difficult than usual, I don't feel a whole heck of a lot until I get to end range. And again, when I get to end range, again, I'm just way more aware of the left side of my low back as compared to the right side. So tight and kind of choppy coming up into flexion. And then it's not too bad going into extension, just doesn't move as well. It doesn't start to feel kind of tight again until the end range of motion. But it's a different kind of tightness. So I don't have any really sharp pain going into flexion or into extension. I can go as far as I can go physically. My end range comes on much sooner than usual, especially into flexion. Like, that's as far as I can go, and it feels like I'm limited by really tight tissue along my spine and in my left side and a lateral trunk. So my end range is sooner than usual, but not painful, just like tight and kind of uncomfortable. So I can still go to end range fully, but sometimes you'll run into instances where you might be coming into flexion and it's like, oh crap, that hurts. So then I'm going to back off of that. So if I were to start experiencing pain here, I'm going to stop my cat-cow or my movement, whatever it is that I'm doing, just a little bit shy of that, and stick to whatever I can do without pain. And if I find anything that feels really good or really relieving, I'll probably push that quite a bit as well. And so if I were to come up into flexion, it's like, oh crap, that hurts. I'm not going to come up quite that far. I won't avoid flexion altogether because I'll probably just end up losing more of it. Instead, I'll use whatever I can use without pain. And if extension feels really good, I might spend a little extra time in extension or hit a few extra reps there just to give myself, it's kind of like your body telling you like, hey, this is what feels good, this is what doesn't feel good, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. It's okay to give your body what you want sometimes, even if it's counterintuitive to what you may think. So that's segmental flexion and extension. Now we're going to turn this into a lumbar car. So we're going to add in side flexion from side to side. And I'm going to try and kind of take my low back joints and just explore everything that I can in those joints to see what I feel and see what I find. So within my limited range of motion anyways, knowing that I won't be able to explore the full thing because, again, everything's kind of tightened up so much that I can't access that full range, but let's see what we can see with what we have access to. So we'll go into flexion. I'll go into flexion. And then I'm going to try and pull my left hip up to my left shoulder. Now that starts to get a little bit uncomfortable. So with that, I start to experience a little bit of pain. If I come down into extension, it goes away. If I side bend over to the other side, I feel again just a touch of pain, but it's very mild. And if I come into flexion, it goes away. And now it just feels tight again. So if I come back around, this feels just tight but not painful. If I come back down, I'm going to stay just shy of where I got that pain because I know it's there. It feels fine if I just stay shy of it. It just feels a little bit tight. If I come over to the right side, again, feels fine. And when I come back up into flexion, again, it just feels really, really tight. And so it feels like I'm not actually getting into flexion. And what's interesting about this is it's all kind of affected my awareness of where my low back is in space today as well. So when I come up here, I'll have to watch this video to actually tell, am I even in spine flexion right now? You'll have a better idea looking at me than I do because I can't feel it as well today. It's kind of like a blind spot. And sometimes that'll happen when you have an injury or sudden onset pain. You'll have a harder time telling where you are in space. Am I moving? Am I in flexion? Am I extension? Again, it doesn't mean that you've lost all your progress. It's just temporary. Got to try and be easy on ourselves here. So again, if I stay within my pain-free range of motion here, as I start to come around, each rep, it actually starts to feel a little better than the last. So sometimes I'll just set a timer and I'll do this for anywhere from like 2 to 10 minutes between going in both directions. And just try and get things moving. The nice thing about us doing this is not only are we exploring our low back and starting to kind of self-assess what's painful, what's not, what movements bother us, which ones don't, where are we feeling this in our body. It's also a way for you to kind of hydrate and flush the joint out. So I like to think of this as a bit of a joint flush. Right now I'm moving the bones around as much as I can without causing more insult. And in doing so, we're pushing fluid around in there. Any inflammation that's in there, we can start to kind of pump it out or flush it out, get some new healthy fluid in with new nutrients. And sometimes that alone, just kind of greasing your low back or hydrating or flushing it like that, can be enough to reduce your symptoms. Sometimes it's not. Again, it kind of depends what's going on for you, right? But it's one of those things that's worth exploring. And what we don't want to do when we experience back pain is basically what Google tells us to do. Now, before I get into that, I'm going to switch directions here. So I've been going around over to the left and then down into extension. Now I'm going to go back up into flexion on the left side. I'm going to side bend all the way over to the right side. Feels very different going this way. I'm going to extend while side bent to the right, and then I'm going to drift back across to the left. Now, when I did a quick Google this morning, just to see what Google's recommending these days for low back pain, not because I had any intentions of following it, it's still your pretty classic, like rest, ice, compress, immobilize, and take anti-inflammatories. So basically, Google wants you to put ice on your back, not move it, take some pills, and then go see your doctor. And so I'm not going to do those things. I haven't been doing those things. I'm doing the opposite of immobilizing. So as you can see right now, I'm actually trying to keep my back moving, trying to maintain whatever motion I have, trying not to let it stiffen up any more than it has already, trying to reestablish that range of motion, flushing fluid around in there, kind of using movement as a bit of an anti-inflammatory rather than taking pills as an anti-inflammatory. And that's not to say that you should never take pills. There's a time and a place for it. Sometimes you have to, and that's fine. For me, this just right now, this is kind of how I'm approaching it. I don't feel like I need to take anything, and I know that by moving my back like this, I'm getting some fluid in there, and that this movement by itself is an anti-inflammatory so long as I'm not pushing really hard into pain or anything like that. So I'm not super surprised that I feel it more on one side than the other, despite, like I said, I didn't do anything, overuse my left side or anything that I could think of other than everything I explained earlier. So that's our lumbar cars, and sometimes I'll take myself through that lying on my back as well. If all fours feels uncomfortable, I'll flip onto my back. And then you can use the floor as feedback, which is nice. It gives you a little bit more information about where your back is in space, whereas when you're on all fours, you don't really get that. So that's an option that you can play around with as well, is just do the exact same thing we did, but laying on your back. You can put your hands on your pelvis if you want. Go through flexion, side flexion to one side, extension over to the other side, and then you can work your way around laying on your back too.